box is going. Recording in progress. Got it. Okay. We're a small group tonight. We can talk about anything anybody wants to talk about. There are so many things one can talk about in these pages. You know, we should stick to what interests you most. I have my list of things that I can talk about, but stop me, make me change directions anytime you feel like it, and especially by making comments in the chat. My habit with looking at this kind of stuff is to look for where the issues are. Look for where the potential debates are.
I don't see you, so just reminding you in case you forgot. Talk to you later. Bye.
So he's leaving a phone message. Okay. I'll run down the list of what I think of as topics we could discuss. Okay. Things that you can have debates about in looking at these letters. You can look at these letters and think of it as Flannery's autobiography and say it's all about life with Mother and what was the relationship really like. You can go through all these letters, these and other sections, and say the really interesting thing is Flannery O'Connor's comments about gender, or her comments about Catholicism, or her comments about her own stories and her novels, and how she is playing literary critic on her own stuff. Or you can take the letters as a writing manual, a bunch of advice about how an artist ought to think, or how an artist might think to get the book written. You can say what's really interesting are Flannery O'Connor's relationships. And, you know, the most important ones in these letters, I guess, are her relationship with Caroline Gordon, her relationship with Marriott Lee, her relationship with the person labeled A in The Habit of Being, who is Betty Hester, who was kept anonymous for the sake of her mental health, I guess, was the idea. You can go through this section of O'Connor's letters and say the interesting topic is what we pick up about O'Connor's attitudes on race. A topic that jumped out at me this time was Flannery O'Connor on the subject of loneliness. I guess because I've been listening to other people have different opinions about how lonely was Flannery O'Connor. And then the last note to myself was that it may not have been apparent, but there's a vague history lesson embedded here. If you look at page, I'll go ahead and say this bit. If you look at page 259, you get a glimpse of how it came to be that we thought it was a good idea to start having groups of people get together and talk about Flannery O'Connor. It started with the idea from a local Episcopal minister who wanted a group of people to get together and talk about theology. This made Flannery very nervous because she thought she was going to have to end up answering all questions about Catholicism and defending the faith, and she didn't know that she was up to it. What a funny attitude for her to have. But it made her nervous. And eventually they did have group discussions of a, cross-section, no, not a cross-section, a selected, group of people, some of whom Flannery didn't know that well, meeting out in Andalusia to talk about philosophy. And then she kind of got tired of that and suggested that they start reading novels. And then I think she decided they weren't quite up to that. And so they started doing short stories. And later people said, oh, let's do something like that. Let's start a Flannery O'Connor book club. Mary Barbara Tate, a family friend, started a book club that ran through the Presbyterian Church. I believe it was. She invited me to come to a meeting. And next thing I know, Mary Barbara isn't showing up anymore. And it became my baby, for which I'm very grateful. I have way too much fun doing these book club sessions. After I bibble at people for 3 hours on Thursday, I feel like, okay, I've thought about those pages some more, and it's good for me. Anybody have any requests about where we start, or shall we just jump in with something? Okay, I'll pick one because I was kind of surprised that I found myself writing this on the list. The topic of Flannery O'Connor and loneliness. She said some things in here that kind of surprised me. There's a line that I've seen quoted quite often in criticism, and I think it's discussed in every biography, suggesting that Flannery felt like she was lonely, that she didn't have enough friends. When she's talking about her father, she says her father needed to have a lot of friends. He needed people, and he was successful. Whereas she had similar desires to have a lot of friends, to have people around her, and she didn't get it. I mean, that's just kind of almost a bold statement that she feels rather lonely in this world. Similar comments, she tells somebody, and I forget who she's talking to, that yes, she has been in love, even though that correspondent might not think so. Well, that kind of suggests that it was one way, there was nothing reciprocated. And so, that's like another way to be lonely, to talk about how you wanted something, and even though it might not look like it, that implies that you were left lonely. And then another passage that gets quoted an awful lot in criticism is about, this is some pages later, 244, Flannery talking about she used to be taken to the orphanage in Augusta and kind of giving those lessons. Look how grateful you should be for what you have and how privileged you are. And Flannery's line there is that she feels as if she is an imaginary orphan. This is just cryptic enough to make a bunch of people talk about it. She's living all these years with Mama right there on the other side of the bedroom door, and constantly with her, and yes, and yet she feels like an orphan. Now, is this just a statement that she feels like that's the way her imagination works, and she can make the most of thinking about people who are, abandoned, cut off, not connected to other humans? Or is she saying she's lonely? Okay. Why is this a debate? Flannery can say just the opposite. She can say, oh, all this talk about the lonely artist makes me want to throw up. That's a rough paraphrase. But still, she doesn't think loneliness is a big deal, something to talk about. She's got a line in here that says, well, maybe it's true that celibacy is required to be a writer. Well, that implies, you're not going to be as connected as you might be. And then there's a passage, I had completely forgotten that Flannery ever wrote this, so much so that I want to read it. On 228, what a peculiar passage this is. You think about all the things Flannery O'Connor has written about peacocks and how meaningful they are, and the key to life and the symbol of everything good, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, page 288, talking to Betty Hester, she writes, I think Betty Hester is saying something in a letter about one of O'Connor's peacocks that was kind of separated from the group because of an injury. if you're wasting any of your sympathy on that peafowl and his loneliness, desist. That is the pathetic fallacy, I think you call it. All that peafowl knows in the way of emotions are two. Where do I get the next thing to put in my craw? And where do I keep out of the way of something that wants to kill me until I can find something I want to kill? Well, isn't that a sweet emotional tribute to peacocks? It's, I've heard people say that peacocks were the love of Flannery O'Connor's life. And yet she can say, they don't care about me. They don't care about anything other than survival. It's a little cold. There's not much touchy-feely going on here. And especially if you've read The Displaced Person recently, in which the peacock just basically seems to be God, it's a little startling to see Flannery give such a different take on the peacock in this letter. So I think she was kind of lonely, and not sure how to deal with it, and trying to make it work for her, and saying, well, it's not that big a deal. But it's complicated. It's hard to know what the right statement is about that. I've watched recently as it seems to me, Monica Miller and Sarah Gordon are saying quite different things on this topic. Monica is interested in the idea that Flannery O'Connor had a network of people who supported her and made things work for her, that she did have plenty of mentors and fans and people she was close to, and through the letters, and that she was fine. She got everything she needed from other people. And, we really shouldn't take her too seriously when she says she didn't have people. Sarah Gordon just gave a talk a couple of weeks ago in Macon, in which she kind of said the opposite, I think. She's talking about Flannery O'Connor had nobody with her most of her life. She was not in the center of literary culture. She was pulling herself up by her bootstraps. She was doing it all for herself. She gets all the credit in the world for what she created because she didn't have an easy go of it in any way. That, everything would have been so much easier for Flannery O'Connor if she'd been able to stay in New York, for example, if she had to go back to Milledgeville and live in the middle of nowhere. And, quite different takes on how much did Flannery need from other people and how much did she get. It seems to me Flannery and the Grammys is that book that's coming out is kind of about that, and it's going to continue to be an issue. One reason I'm sure it's going to be an issue is that Carol Schloss is several chapters into writing a double biography, a biography of Regina and Flannery right now. And lucky me, she's showing me chapters as she drafts them. And I'm thrilled with the results so far. It's all about the relationship between Flannery and her mother, and there are all kinds of amazing, that's a safe word, amazing things that Carol is digging up, public records. And she went to Emory and went through Regina's check stubs, for example. And, just kind of amazing things about how the household was run and how they dealt with each other financially and legally. And not just legalities between mother daughter. I mean, one of Carol's angles of research is that Regina went to court to change the will that gave her Andalusia. And she got a court to change the rules that had been set down by the person who left the farm to her, kind of. It's more complicated. I mean, it's complicated. But that was another thing Flannery had to deal with, that her mother was in a court battle with family about who really owns this farm. It complicates one's sense of the mood in the house when they're kind of at war, might be a little strong, at odds with other people in the family about who's in charge here and who has rights. I want to point out what's in the chat. We are blessed in our deprivations, and Flannery's very aware she's got them. And question is, how true is it that she could make her deprivations work for her? I mean, for some people, she's just like the best example of somebody who can make every problem. I mean, she almost made lupus good for her. Make every deprivation produce better writing. Okay. And Heidi's making a comment about, well, I'm going to ask you, Heidi, to spell this out. On pages 170, 171, there's a rather famous chapter about Flannery talking to Betty Hester about the extent to which Flannery is like Holga in Good Country People. You want to unmute and talk about that a little bit? Yeah. And maybe you're doing that on.
No, it's okay.
Right.
I'll stop. That's what struck me reading the letters this time through too, was that loneliness. And I actually had the reverse. I'm like, really? Within 6 months' time, she's made connections to Carolyn, Marriott Lee, Billy Sessions, Cecil Dawkins, and Louise Abbott. I mean, that's 5 friends in 6 months. Like, can any of us, besides kindergarten, stay at a time when we got 5 friends in that short of time? So I really do feel like we can find evidence on both sides of the story, but really what ends up happening is, was that enough for Flannery? I like what you said about that. And we will never be able to know that.
No.
We can count the letters. We can count how many trips she was taking and how many invitations she had to speak. That's how close she came to me, was St. Catherine's in Minneapolis. And that's when she met Carolyn. So that's my little tiny toehold with Flannery. But ultimately, I think we need to ask Flannery if that was enough. And I don't know if we will know. But page 170 is really interesting. I mean, I had to go back and look because it's 3 letters in succession that she writes to Betty, but she's even kind of spicy here to Betty in this letter, when she says that that my story screamed to you that I have never consented to be in love with anybody is merely to prove that they are screaming in historical inaccuracy. I have, God help me, consented to this frequently. Yeah. Now that Helga is repugnant to you only makes her more believable. So yeah, that's a really interesting letter too.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, it feels like she's clarifying something in a way, but it's cryptic too. What does she mean by that? How true is that? And do you really think that Flannery O'Connor is like Holga Joy Hopewell, or that she's really distancing herself from that character? She talks about how she can dominate Holga. Well, I'm not sure anybody can dominate Holga. It just seems that like that's a really complicated character. So, we can bring it all back to the loneliness debate and say, well, isn't that interesting that you can make a case for a variety of positions about how this person who wrote these thousands of letters, and apparently, would write letters to several different people on the same day. How lonely was she? How much did this letter writing thing work for her? How satisfying was this? Is this a good way to live a life? I mean, I would say she did fine, but some other people might think this is a little weird.
Could I ask
Yes, we
another
have a hand up.
real quick question?
Yeah,
Is that
sure.
okay? Sorry. So do we know who this S is? That's also another thing that really caught my interest. It's early on in the letters this time that we read, but this man who writes long letters, almost sounds like diatribes, who ends up being institutionalized. She never identifies who that is, and we don't have any letters from him that are included by Sally. But do you know more information about
I
that
don't.
person?
That's a passage that makes me generalize every once in a while. Flannery O'Connor would answer anybody. And it may be that in a biography somewhere, somebody, maybe Brad Gooch or Jane Cash, figured out who that person was, because it seems to me somewhere I've read about what became of some of these people that randomly wrote to Flannery, and you might be surprised that she wrote them back. And was this just like good deeds by Flannery, or did she really constantly stay on the lookout for the next person who might be a good friend to her? Sometimes I think she couldn't possibly think that these people are going to become close. She just doesn't want to ignore people. She doesn't want to be rude. Isn't that interesting? Flannery O'Connor had a problem with being rude. You'd think the person who read some of these stories would be real comfortable with rudeness. Okay, what's this other question that's up here? You've got your hand up.
I have my hand up.
Yeah.
So I think that this is my first pass through the book, and I'm reading it quickly, and Flannery is not easy to decipher at all. A lot of her letters, especially to A about religion, I don't even understand. And as a Catholic who's strayed very far from the religion, I there's so much of her stuff I just don't understand, which is amazing, and it makes me want to read her again. I mean, so she's frustrating and interesting at the same time. But I think my take on this sense of loneliness, some of these letters are pages and pages long, and I wonder how much did that person respond back in turn. For example, A, when she writes A, she literally writes pages of comments. Was it a mutually reciprocated relationship? Yes.
I went into the Emory Library, the only trip I've made to the Emory Library. I went in on the day that they announced that the collection was open, and they had the Betty Hester letters, or maybe not the first day, maybe the third day. Well, anyway, the helpful person at the desk walked over to where I was sitting and put all of Betty Hester's letters on the table in front of me. And it was quite the stack. My first thought was, I could steal these and they'd never know. Because there's so much stuff. Isn't that evil? That was my first thought. I mean, there was no way I could possibly read all this stuff. But I thought, well, she wrote back. It wasn't just, Flannery beating this relationship to death with long letters that Betty Hester didn't want to receive. Betty Hester wrote a lot of letters. And the other version of that answer I can give, I asked Special Collections the other day, because you get introduced to Marriott Lee here, another major correspondent. So how many letters from Marriott Lee do we have here at Georgia College? And the answer was 95. I don't think I've ever written 95 letters to anybody in my life. maybe emails, okay. But letters of the sort we got here, no, Mary Lee was really interested in writing back to Flannery. They have more letters from Flannery to Mary Lee than they have letters from Mary Lee to Flannery, but it may be a question of, some of them got lost that Mary Lee wrote to Flannery. So if counting matters, yeah, they wrote a lot of letters. This was like a chunk of every day is Flannery sitting down in that bedroom and saying, now, where was the conversation when we left off last time? And let's pick it up. And sometimes picking it up meant, let's talk about theology some more in ways that some people would find really difficult to follow. There have been times when I have looked at this book and I thought, oh, surely we're just getting the highlights, the really serious stuff. No, Flannery O'Connor is perfectly capable of writing a letter and being into theology within 2 lines of the beginning of the letter. She can make light and she can make jokes and she can talk about the chickens and mama, but she can also just get right to whatever picky, complicated point has been discussed in the last letter she wrote to somebody. It's a really amazing thing about the letters. Sue, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment and then ask a question. I've always been struck by the letters with the sense that there's a tertiary audience. Of course, there's the person to whom she's writing the letter, but I've always had this sense that O'Connor was aware other people were going to read these letters and that she's writing for both that personal audience and also this sort of larger audience. My question is, I read the Brainerd Cheney letters early on. I read those before I read The Habit of Being. And I'm wondering if anybody has looked at the letters in that way. Is there a time when she becomes more self-aware and the letters become more of this crafted thing? Because the repetitions in stories, the jokes that get shared, that seems to me to be very self-aware.
Yeah. She kept carbon copies. And, could be because she just wants to keep track of how the conversation's been going so that she can pick up where they left off last time. Maybe she figured out she needed to remember what she said so she doesn't contradict herself. But I think Flannery O'Connor always believed that she was a genius and someday people would be looking at these things and that she welcomed that. She could have thrown away letters after a time thinking, oh, well, I'm not going to need these anymore. But she kept an awful lot of stuff. And I mean, I can't say I have experience where I thought somebody other than the recipient of a letter I was writing was going to see it. But I'm sure it changes things. If you've just heard somebody say to you, don't put anything in an email that you wouldn't want to see in the paper. Haven't you heard that line?
Yeah.
It changes the next email. You're right. You say, oh, well, I better not say that. Better not put that in print. Better just call them up on the phone and say, okay, what I meant to add was such and such, that you don't want under any circumstances to be in a personal letter.
Right.
And yeah, that okay, to go back to your question, has anybody studied them that way? A little bit, but there's so much more to be done with Flannery O'Connor's correspondence. We're just getting started, on this. It's such a complicated set of texts. And we know we don't have the whole record. There are little deposits of letters all over the country in special collections libraries, and we're all going to have to wait until, 200 years from now where nothing's under copyright. And we have a 20-volume set of Flannery O'Connor's correspondence to everybody, and it'll be so big that nobody will be able to finish it. And then we can do, and then somebody's dissertation can be about how did her style in these letters and the strategy in these letters change over the years as she became more aware of the letters as like a literary genre.
Mhm.
I think you can read letters home. If you look at that, the letters she wrote from Iowa that Monica Miller just edited for a volume. That's a quite different tone. It seems to me that's most definitely for Mama. She says some things in there, and here we are all reading it, and I feel a little embarrassed sometimes to see some of the stuff she's saying to her mother, and I think she wouldn't want me reading this, but here I am reading it. And when I read, what's in The Habit of Being, I just think, oh yeah, she wants everybody to read this. She wants everybody to study this. This is part of her campaign to tell the world how to approach the fiction if you want to be on her wavelength. But yeah, things changed. Things changed for her. And you can also say things change from correspondent to correspondent. The way Flannery O'Connor sounds when she's talking to Betty Hester is quite different from the way she sounds when she's talking to Marriott Lee. I mean, the Flannery O'Connor who writes letters to Marriott Lee just seems like a whole nother kind of a person. And my take has always been, without careful study or evidence or any of that troubling stuff, my assumption has always been Flannery O'Connor just figured out who a correspondent needed her to be, and then she tried to be that person. And she's nice. She wants to be a good friend. That's how I've always explained to myself these gaps, the differences in sets of letters. And that's in a way, I guess I think that's kind of counter to the notion that she thought all of her letters were part of this grand scheme to explain everything in the universe, in these personal letters, each of which is the next chapter in Flannery O'Connor's philosophy of the world. Sometimes she's so playful. I've run into a couple of people who say they like reading The Habit of Being, but all they care about are her jokes, the one-liners she throws in along the way, and they don't really care about who are these people or what does she think about this particular issue. They just think she's awfully funny off the top of her head. I mean, I don't think she wrote drafts of letters. I think this is just how they came out of the typewriter. I started to say out of the computer, how they came out of the typewriter, and she didn't look back. Letters that I've seen, there aren't even a whole lot of crossouts. She didn't go back and do a whole lot of correcting. And that all amazes me. Letter writing is almost passe now. I mean, people just don't get why you would spend so much time on such an activity. But I'm glad she did. Okay, let's see what else. And this quote has always baffled me. Lord, I'm glad I'm a hermit novelist. Well, sure, that is perfectly relevant to this topic. There's that book, Flannery O'Connor, Hermit Novelist. Like, that's the key to it, that she thought she was like one of the early church fathers, in total isolation and living the hermit's life, and that's good for her. Don't let all this other stuff that interferes with the writing life get in your way. This is like, oh, maybe it's good that I got sick because therefore I don't have to do this and this and this and this and this. That's the usual expectation for a woman of my place and time. And I'm free to spend, as many hours writing as I have energy for. And so, she told herself she was making it work. Does that really mean she likes being a hermit? That implies that she's alone. And that, I don't usually think of hermits as writing 5 letters every afternoon to 5 different correspondents. And she kind of has it both ways. She can make the world go away when she wants to make the world go away and concentrate on her novel. And then she knows what to do when she wants to be in touch with somebody. She writes a letter and pulls out their last letter and reviews it, and then writes the next letter. Okay, we got a hand up.
I believe that's me. Regarding Flannery and her mother, what was the power relationship between them? Did it change, or was one person always dominant? And if she was the low man on the totem pole, would that say that her loneliness was increased and she needed to reach out to these other people to assuage her hurt feelings or self-esteem?
I don't know. Other people might have better answers than I have for this one. I would say Regina was always the boss.
Okay.
And Flannery's territory was writing. But her mama didn't care about the writing. It was like Flannery had this secret. She could go into her bedroom and her typing desk and say, okay, this is mine and I control this, and I'm, the queen when it comes to this little piece of life. But I don't see Regina as somebody who was intimidated by that one bit. Regina was running the farm, and Flannery was just kind of a drain on the finances. And this is my, how I suspect. And Flannery took a little bit of power back through humor. She could make Mama the butt of a joke in a concluding paragraph of a letter to somebody. But every time I read about Regina, I think of her as somebody who's totally self-confident, thinks she knows the answer to everything, and she's ready to run everybody's life, and did a fairly good job of it, running everybody's life. And she did run Flannery's life in lots of ways. And Flannery had very carefully to live her real life over here in the margin in this one room, kind of in secret. And it's a good thing, Regina fell asleep when she was reading stories. They could have had much more of a power struggle than they had. I'm sorry, there must be a way to make an argument that Flannery was really control at the farm, but it just doesn't come to me, I think. And since Georgia College took over Andalusia, they have redone the inside of the house it's almost the thesis statement of the house right now, is that when you go to Andalusia, you are visiting Regina Klein O'Connor's fortress. And there's her daughter over there in the corner writing short stories that some people like. But they've rearranged the furniture and set things up so that you can see that when Regina was sitting at her desk, she could see everything and be in control of everything and see anybody who was coming up the road. Regina was the boss. And well, maybe she had to be. maybe that was the only way they could keep going. Now, one of Flannery's strategies is to have correspondents who were not the sort of people that Regina would have approved of. I mean, Mary Lee is a great example. Mary Lee is the sister of president of Georgia State College for Women. But, when Mary Lee came to town, it was, now let's see how much I can irritate everybody in town before I go back home. She would just do anything to look outrageous. And Flannery would invite her to the house. And, Flannery is responsible for causing her mother to have polite chit chat with Mary Lee. And so that's a kind of backward way for Flannery to have a little power over her mother, but it's very sneaky, and I don't think Regina ever thought she was losing control. This is just a little game that Flannery might play on the side to say, well, you're not going to cut me off from, everybody else in the world, and you're still going to have to see that I have, this little life that's very different from yours, Mama. Yes, the house is quite different. And there's the interpretive center too. Okay, I don't know. We talked about this in October, but I should say, a lot's going on. We just opened the interpretive center. So there's a $3 million, it's tiny, but it's a $3 million building front lawn with a parking lot. And you walk to the main house, or you get in a golf cart and you're driven up to the main house. There's no parking next to the main house anymore. The house is rearranged, probably more authentically than it used to be. And the other thing to say is, Georgia College has inherited a whole bunch of stuff. I don't even know how much. I ask every once in a while, and somebody gives me an answer, and I find myself having a hard time believing it. Georgia College got the Klein Mansion on Green Street. We have that house that Louise Florencourt was living in and everything in it. Well, the house was full of family stuff. Who is going to take care of that? Well, the answer is Matt Davis, but how in the world can Matt take care of all that stuff? I've been told that all the clothes are, being processed the way archivists do things. And there are a number of, Regina's clothing products, that she made on display in the interpretive center at any time, and they're going to be rotated. You're going to see all the clothes that everybody wore. She spent a lot of time making clothes from patterns, but she did innovations. I mean, she changed patterns to make it just right for Flannery. It's an interesting thing. And I think I've heard that Louise Florencourt had a bunch of stuff that she couldn't fit into the Klein Mansion in storage bins around town. I never knew where the storage bins were. I was not high up to be able to find that stuff out. But now I'm picking up that, oh my God, somebody's got to go through it all and figure it out and do something with it. And we're at square one. We caught the bus. We don't know what's in it. We being Georgia College, where I am now part-time staff. Okay, I am officially retired. They got a lot to work on, and it's all gonna turn into more and more questions. The questions are going to come faster than the answers. We're going to look at, we're going to open up a box and we're going to say, what in the world is this? And who's going to know the answer? Frances, the other cousin who lives in the Boston area, she's going to have to come down here an awful lot and go through stuff with people and say, oh, yes, I can tell you what that strange looking item is, because, some of the stuff is unique, peculiar, stuff that most people don't have. And there's a lot of there's a lot of work to be done. So we're going to learn more and more and more about how little we know. That's like real education. We are getting really good at realizing how much we don't know about things. The more you know about Flannery, the more you feel like she may be mysterious. What's really going on? And the next piece of data may not explain anything. It may just raise more questions than it answers. And the Betty Hester letters are still to be published someday. Nobody's ever published the Marriott Lee letters. You can come to Milledgeville and read 95 letters that Marriott Lee wrote to Flannery, but one person at a time can do that. And how many notes are you going to take while you're doing that so you can remember what you read? I read all the letters and I took notes. Where are the notes? It was 30 years ago. I've forgotten more than I knew. It's a really interesting set of letters. There are letters to Elizabeth Bishop. She comes up in passing here. Well, yeah. There are 9 letters from Flannery O'Connor to Elizabeth Bishop, and Elizabeth Bishop wrote letters to Flannery O'Connor, and who knew? And we don't know the full record of what's there. Louise kept control of all of that stuff. I suspect those letters are in the collection that was sold to Emory. But nobody's done anything with them yet. And oh, by the way, everything's going to change. I mean, I just said, here are 2 books that are forthcoming. I think there are people who are opening up the filing cabinet doors all over America who are saying, oh, time to publish that book. The one that I abandoned because nobody could get permission to do anything. The answer has been no to permission requests for decades. And I don't want to speak for the new executor, but I think the answer is going to start being yes pretty consistently when people say, I would like to publish this book where we publish previously unpublished stuff. And people who were refused permission and just put that project away in the filing cabinet drawer, they're going to be pulling that thing out. And we're going to have us a renaissance of Flannery O'Connor publications. Did you know there was a shortage? We didn't have enough stuff published about Flannery O'Connor. I think there's going to be quite a bit more in coming years, and we'll know more about these people she's talking to. One of the articles in the Flannery O'Connor Review is, I would say is really good, but it's a kind of beginning thing about now who is this Marriott Lee, and now we finally got some examples of her plays. Her papers are all at West Virginia University. And Carol Harris has been given permission to work with some of them. And she's, I think, steadily, constantly working on them. But there's a whole lot to be done. And let me tell you, what I can pick up is that Marriott Lee makes Flannery O'Connor look like the most organized person in the world. Marriott just kind of was constantly revising everything. When she put on a play, it was slightly different from the last time she put on the same play, and she threw it all in a box, and it's hard to keep straight. If she created something, she gave it a new name every Thursday, and it's hard to keep track of. She's a fascinating person. I would love to, I will get around to it because I've got some of them. I will enjoy reading some of her plays because I think Flannery really appreciated them. And I want to see, how did Flannery O'Connor appreciate these plays created in this strange way that Marriott Lee worked? I mean, you know, one of the details in the article by this guy who worked with Marriott Lee is that she would walk around in Harlem and she would say, okay, I'm going to go in every apartment building. I'm going to go to the third floor and I'm going to pick the third apartment on that floor and I'm going to ask them if they'd be in my play. And she'd do this random thing until she got a cast together. She'd ask them to tell her the stories of their lives until she based a play on it. You know, how far away could you get from the way Flannery O'Connor worked? And that was what Marriott did. And she showed some of it to Flannery O'Connor, and Flannery O'Connor said, "This is great. We should just have an area of New York City set aside for you to do play after play after play like this all the time." Golly. You know, Flannery had an open mind about some things at least. Okay, your next question, hand up.
All right, looks like that's me. With regards to Flannery's view on race, and this is in really reply or in response to Heidi's question. With regards to Flannery's views on racism, the fact that she was prejudiced, how many people just say, oh, she acted in the manner of the time? And she wasn't really prejudiced because all people were prejudiced, versus how many people think that she was really prejudiced?
Well,
And discounting the manners of the day.
yeah. Well, most people who continue to write about Flannery O'Connor and continue to teach her, you know, we rationalize it.
Mm-hmm.
Make excuses for it. We use various strategies to make it not so bad. On the other hand, I know people who give up on Flannery O'Connor, who stopped teaching her.
Well, and we do that.
We shouldn't talk about her.
Yeah, we do that with anti-Semitism too. FDR was very anti-Semitic, and he refused the Jews coming in from the Lusitania, wherever that was going to dock. And we just excuse that, saying, oh, that was the time of day. And we do that with countless other public figures. I just wonder, is that the right thing to do? And do people, you know, what's the percentage of people who excuse it versus think it's just the time, that those manners of the day? I know that this isn't as
it's 8 o'clock. We gotta stop.
Yeah.
That's the toughest question. I know we have to have more and more regular discussions of race and O'Connor. And it's like the major topic for a lot of people who maybe are going to stop teaching O'Connor, stop reading O'Connor. And then I'm not going to quit thinking about Flannery O'Connor. It doesn't stop me none, and I have various questionable strategies. I mean, one of them is, okay, show me the author about whom we cannot ask similar questions. I mean, if we only read people who are morally pure, we're going to have a really short reading list.
Yep, that's a fact.
Okay, part of what you study is how flawed is this person, and how did the flaws of the person relate to the wonders of the literature that result. And okay, I can agree that, you know, if I ever walk into a classroom again, it will be kind of part of what you have to talk about is, well, you know, here's this person who had these thoughts and did these things and wasn't nice to her mother, and she wrote Revelation. She wrote Good Country People. And, you know, I don't care really who the person is who wrote Good Country People and Revelation. Those are worth reading. and several other Flannery O'Connor stories. I don't mean to say it's just two. It's not really an open debate.
We need to wrap it up, Bruce.
Yeah, we need to wrap it up. Okay, that was the quick answer to the hardest question in all of O'Connor studies right now. Thank you very much for taking us there. Thank you for showing me a good time. I really enjoyed talking to you, and keep reading. We're going to do this again in January, February, March, and April next year, at which point we will have read everything and know everything about Flannery O'Connor's letters, right? Okay, thank you. See you again. Thank you for your good questions.